Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. If you haven't heard that at least 1,000 times, because the greeting works for the whole of January. Unfortunately, 2021 started out quite tumultuously, but hopefully things get better. And with the vaccines coming out, we just have to hunker down for a couple of more months. Now let me welcome Sam, president of the EAA Chapter 20, to give an introduction of our group.
Hey, thanks very much, Anand, and thank you all for joining us. As Anand mentioned, I'm the president of the local chapter, Chapter 20. We have an amazing group of volunteers, such as Anand and Alexander. We put on events like this to engage the local Bay Area aviation community. We're doing these talks, and we're also starting up our second RV-12 build, which is we're all excited to see get going. So we'll be having our chapter meeting and social after our official presentation by Alexander. So stick around, hear about our latest updates. And for those who registered for our chapter on our website, we have a drawing for a $50 gift card from the San Carlos Aviation Supply. So, be interested in that. If you're interested in our chapter and just want to talk aviation, please feel free to reach out and connect with us. We're always looking for new members and volunteers. You can email us at info@eaa20.org. So, hey, thanks very much for attending, and look forward to talking to you guys. So, take it away, guys.
Thanks for the intro, Sam. Today, EAA Chapter 20 board member Alexander Chavez is going to address the 6 types of pilot certifications and recommendations for paths to the air and how to do so at a lower cost. By day, he designs futuristic autonomous vehicles at Argo AI, but his ardor for aviation led him to get a commercial pilot license. He's also a new EAA Chapter 20 board member. So without further ado, welcome, Alexander. Thanks for joining us.
So as he mentioned, I'll be discussing the introduction for different types of pilot certifications, ratings, and paths to getting your license and getting in the air. This is a fairly introductory talk geared towards our young aviators who have not flown before or who've only just started their flying lessons. So apologies to the more experienced members of the group. Brief introduction, background in academics at Caltech and MIT Business School. I did some work for NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, factory automation at Niagara in Southern California, and then autonomous vehicles at both TuSimple and Argo. I built an RV-7A and now own an RV-9 tailwheel that I love to take flying, camping, hiking, and things like that. So why do you want to be a pilot? If you haven't seen these types of jokes before, you can see what your friends might think you'll do, what the public thinks you do, what your family thinks you do, what the boss thinks you do, what you can tell your dates, and what you really do is paperwork. Anyway, so here's an overview of the 3 starting entrants to becoming a pilot. There are 6 general paths overall, and I'm going to go through all 6 during the presentation. So for these 3, you have to choose one to start. One of these will be your initial license. If you have any medical conditions which prevent you from progressing further, you will probably be limited to a sport pilot's license. Otherwise, you will either need to get a 3rd-class medical, which I won't go into too much detail about, but that requires an exam from an FAA medical examiner, or a newer process called Basic Med, where your normal doctor fills out a specific FAA questionnaire certifying you as safe for flight. The sport pilot can fly planes up to 1,320 pounds max weight, which is limited to 2 seats and 120 knots maximum speed for the plane. Recreational pilots can fly up to 180 horsepower planes initially. They can get add-ons to fly larger planes later, 4 seats, but only 1 passenger. So this is most common for people, these first 2 in general are pretty common for people who just want to fly for fun, only in their local region, usually only in the day, usually for sightseeing. There are exceptions to this, which I'll get into, but those are the most common uses of these 2. The most common license that people will initially start with is actually the 3rd one, which is the private pilot. So that allows you to fly planes up to 12,500 pounds. and allows add-ons for heavier or faster planes in the future as well. Only private pilots can fly planes with retractable landing gear, and only private pilots can fly more than one passenger at a time. In terms of the minimum flight training required, notice I say flight training. The FAA doesn't care how you get the ground knowledge. If you are a genius and take the written exam and pass on your first time without studying, good luck, but congratulations. Or if you need 1,000 hours, they don't track it. Ground study is whatever you need to pass the written exam. For flight training, the sport pilot has the fewest hours required, 20, but the national average for people who pass is 33. Recreational pilot requires 30 hours, the national average for people who pass is 44, or private pilot, minimum of 40, average of 70. So you can see that with the additional privileges comes additional training. Flight in Class B, C, and D airspace, which for the student pilots is basically most airports in the Bay Area. SFO is B, Oakland and San Jose are C, and basically every other airport in this area is D. So for practical purposes, anyone listening to this talk will need to be able to do this. When you first get your sport or recreational pilot's license, you are not automatically allowed to fly in controlled airspace of those types. You need additional training for that, whereas that's part of the private pilot training and included in the 40 or 70 hours. Sport pilots cannot fly at night, ever. Recreational pilots can, but without passengers and under previous consultation with a certified flight instructor, or to get training to move on to a private pilot's license or further. And private pilots night training is part of getting the license. Private pilots are the only of these three who can fly outside of the United States, and the only ones who can fly in less than 3 miles visibility, specifically in uncontrolled airspace. I will put a caveat on that is not safe for most private pilots, and I strongly recommend against doing that, even if it's legal. Private pilots are also the only ones who can conduct sightseeing flights benefiting a charity or community. There is sort of an exception for Young Eagles. Sport pilots can also fly Young Eagle flights, as can recreational, but you cannot deduct that on your taxes. Private pilots can. Other limitations, both sport and recreational pilots are limited to 10,000 feet MSL, meaning above sea level, or 2,000 feet above the ground, whichever is higher. And you cannot fly VFR over the top, which means you cannot fly above clouds when you cannot see the ground. Additionally, recreational pilots can only fly 50 miles from their home base without an endorsement from a certified flight instructor. That is the only limitation that a recreational pilot has, which a sport pilot does not. In general, the recreational pilot is more permissible than the sport pilot. Private pilots do not have the VFR on top restriction, and their altitude is limited to 1 foot below 18,000 feet, as opposed to just 10,000. As for the number of pilots, the FAA publishes statistics. At the end of 2019, there were just shy of 200,000 student pilots in the United States. If you look at the numbers on the right, you'll notice a big difference here. There's only 127 recreational pilots in the US. That's because you end up doing most of the flight training to become a private pilot, but have significant limitations. You can only take one passenger. You can only fly 50 miles. So although there are no publicly announced plans to phase this out, for practical purposes, this license effectively doesn't exist. It doesn't benefit most people. Sport pilot, there are 6,467 at the end of last year. I know at least one of them is in this club. Again, because of the limitations, most people do not go this route even as a stepping stone. Most people find it beneficial to go straight to the private pilot, and that's reflected in the numbers. There are 161,000 currently licensed and active private pilots in the United States. I will proceed on, but first, are there any questions about the permissions, limitations, etc., while we're still talking about this? Okay. Feel free to ask. Oh, did someone just say something?
Yeah, is it hard to get an endorsement for recreational pilots to travel out of 50 NM?
NM is nautical miles, by the way. So it depends on your flight instructor and your training. Basically, most of that training will focus around navigation. So when you're learning to fly in the Bay Area, it's pretty easy to look from the sky and see there's the 101, there's the Golden Gate Bridge, there's Oakland, and have a sense for where you're going. When you're not familiar with the space, you need additional training on navigation aids, additional training on making sure how to follow maps, wayfinding, pilotage. We have GPS today, but you should learn what happens when GPS goes out, because it does happen occasionally. So that's the type of training that you would do to get that endorsement. Depending on the student, this can take anywhere from 2 to 10 hours. And if you compare the 30 to 40-hour difference between recreational private pilot, that again, if you're going to do that additional training, I would recommend that you go for the private pilot option. Any other questions? Okay, feel free to ask me at the end as well on any topic that we discuss. All right, so the 6 types of pilot's license that was mentioned at the start of this talk is actually a misnomer. There's technically 5, but for practical purposes, there's something called an instrument rating, which you might as well treat as one of the 6. An instrument rating allows a private pilot or higher to fly in bad weather. So when you get your private pilot's license, you will not be allowed to fly in clouds or when you can't see outside the plane, because you won't be trained on flying at the instruments, just the panel in front of you. That's what the add-on instrument rating is. It's typically done as the next step in training after getting your private pilot's license. The medical requirements are the same. The aircrafts that you can fly are the same. The requirements is an additional 40 hours of training in what is called actual or simulated instrument conditions. Actual would be flying in clouds with an instructor, and simulated is where you wear a view limiting device that prevents you from seeing outside the aircraft and only allows you to see the gauges in front of you. So learning how to navigate and fly the plane just based on the instruments in front of you. So you'll need 40 hours of instrument training and 50 hours of cross-country training. Cross-country is defined as flights with a landing more than 50 nautical miles away from your home airport or your initial point of departure. Unlike the licenses on the previous screen, it is not common to need additional hours for instrument rating unless you take a break partway through or only have one lesson a month. Almost everyone finishes their instrument rating in basically the minimum hours required. I'll also note that these 40 and 50-hour requirements can be done separately or combined. So if you are practicing for your instrument rating, you can fly under the hood and also the hood is the view limiting device, and also land somewhere at least 50 nautical miles away from your point of departure. And then those hours count to both requirements, significantly cutting down on the amount of time you need to fly. But they don't have to be done combined. You could, for example, get your private pilot's license, fly with friends on trips up and down the coast, go to Los Angeles after the pandemic, things like that, and then do just the hood training separately. Either route is fine. Instrument rating also allows you to fly in Class A airspace. Class A is the airspace above 18,000 feet in the United States, which is why the private pilot is limited to below that, because they don't have an instrument rating. An instrument rating allows you to fly in IMC, or instrument meteorological conditions, basically when you can't see outside the plane. You still can't get paid though, and none of the licenses on the previous page allow you to be paid either. The most that you can do is split costs, whether that's gas, rental fees, etc., with your passengers, but you must always pay a minimum of your pro rata share. So if there's 3 people in the plane, you always have to pay at least a third of the flight. There's no other particular limitations to discuss about the instrument rating, and this is the most common level held throughout the United States, with over 314,000 people holding active instrument ratings in the US. Commercial pilot. Sounds like you're about to get paid. So you require a higher level of medical certificate for this, which is called a second class medical. You still can't fly any larger planes, which surprises most people, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. It requires 250 hours or 190 if you go through what's called a Part 141 school. That's a very structured school where you're basically becoming a pilot full-time, 40 hours a week sort of thing, in a classroom, in a very structured environment. So these next two yeses for a flight in IMC and Class A airspace with a commercial pilot are technically no's, in that technically it is the instrument rating that allows you to do this. However, it is almost unheard of for a commercial pilot to not have an instrument rating. So for practical purposes, I put the answer as yes. As a commercial pilot's name implies, you can also start getting paid, except you cannot work for an airline or in flight instruction. Now, this is what surprises most people about the commercial pilot. When you think commercial pilot, you think American Airlines or United. So a commercial pilot allows you to be paid to work charter flights, banner towing, skydiving, and other odd aviation jobs, crop dusting, things like that. There is a separate airline transport pilot license to work for the airlines themselves. And the difference between a charter and an airline is airlines have publicly available schedules that anyone can go online and buy a ticket. And the charter flights are more one-off. So, limitations. You can fly people for money. No, you cannot. You can work as a pilot, but you actually cannot hold out to friends, family, or the general public to offer your services. So you can work for a charter company, you can work for a banner towing service or whatnot, but you cannot fly people for money yourself. That requires not a pilot's license, but that requires setting up a specific type of business called a Part 135 operation to fly charter flights with the FAA. That's a business requirement and outside the scope of this presentation. And there's a little over 100,000 commercial pilots in the US. As I started to mention, airline transport pilot, this is flying for the airlines. So anything from your local regional flights like Mesa Airlines or NextJet, all the way up to United and American and Southwest. But even as an airline pilot, you still can't fly planes over 12,500 pounds. I'll come to that on the next slide. The requirements here are much more varied. It typically takes 1,500 hours of experience before you can be an airline pilot, but there are exceptions. If you got your flight training in the military, it's half of that. If you have a degree in aviation that's a bachelor's, you need 1,000, or if you have an associate's in aviation, you need 1,250 hours. And I already mentioned the no holding out. This allows you to work for an airline, not to be or start an airline. There are almost 165,000 airline pilots in the US. Age limitations. Technically, there is no age limit for being a student pilot or starting to learn. That being said, you can't actually fly solo without an instructor until your 16th birthday. And you sometimes hear of people soloing for the first time on their 16th birthday. That's usually because they've been flying with a parent or someone else close to them for many years before that. You can get your sport recreational private instrument or drone license at the age of 17. You can get your commercial license at 18. And to be an airline pilot, you have to be 23. There's also an exception where you can get a restricted license that allows you to be second in command only at the age of 21. I won't be going more into that, but feel free to ask questions on it if you have any. A commercial license is also required before becoming a certified flight instructor. Being certified to teach is separate from being certified to fly. All right. What if you want to fly something faster, nicer, better, etc.? So there are endorsements. These are signatures from a flight instructor that you have demonstrated ability in certain areas. You do not need to take a written exam or an FAA exam for these. You can get endorsements to fly complex planes, which are planes with retractable landing gear, flaps, and a constant speed or variable pitch propeller. High performance is more than 200 horsepower. Tailwheel. Tailwheel is beneficial because both from cool planes like Warbirds, this is the P-51 Mustang, to RVs and small aircraft with tail wheels that are better for landing on grass and dirt strips and expanding the envelope of what you can fly that way, as well as for pressurized cabins above 2,000 or 25,000 feet. I mentioned previously that even when you have an airline transport license, you cannot fly anything over 12,500 pounds, and every airline is over 12,500 pounds. So there's an additional add-on to any license from private onward called a type rating. A type rating is necessary for any plane over 12,500 pounds, any jet or turbine aircraft, including those under that weight limit. You do not need a type rating for turboprop piston planes. And there are a very limited number of other aircraft where a type rating may be specifically required by the FAA, but for practical purposes, you're never going to encounter those, and you would know before you do. So a type rating is required for every specific type of aircraft. By that, I mean, if you've been working for United for 40 years and you have type ratings in a 737, 47, 57, 77, and 87, you cannot fly a 767 without getting an additional 767 type rating, no matter how much experience you have. Now, this all sounds expensive, and it can be, but there are ways to reduce the cost. The first thing is more of a thought experiment. Figure out why you want to fly and what your main mission profile is going to be. Do you just want to take friends flying over the Golden Gate Bridge once a month, and you have no real desire to fly more than that? You think it's cool. You might fly over to Watsonville for a hamburger occasionally, and that's about it. Or do you want to take long cross-country flights? Do you want to go land on, in the backcountry and go camping in the middle of nowhere with your airplane? And answering those questions will not always drastically change, but can guide where you focus your training. For example, if you like to hike or camp and want to do any backcountry flying, it's a lot cheaper to learn in a tailwheel aircraft right off the bat, rather than learn in, say, a Cessna and transition to tailwheel later. I'm not going to go into every single example here, but think about what types of flying you might want to do, and that can cut down on the number of hours you need to get your license. Apply for scholarships. EAA Chapter 20 has several. The EAA National has some, and there's a number of other organizations with scholarship for especially people under the age of 21 and others who may qualify. There are two general ways to get your license. I briefly mentioned Part 141 earlier. That's a very structured school, typically reserved for people who are trying to get to the airlines as fast as possible or become a professional pilot as fast as possible. It's the most expensive option. It's also typically the fastest. I would estimate that most people on this call are not interested in skipping college and going straight to the airlines. So for most people, you will do what's called Part 91. That's much more about finding an instructor and doing one-on-one instruction in a less structured setting. They're still certified by the FAA. They still have the exact same training as the instructors in a Part 41 school, but it's much more at your own pace. Within Part 91, there are both for and nonprofit operations. EAA Chapter 20 generally recommends San Carlos Flight Center, but that is actually a for-profit operation. If you're looking to save money in the local area, there's also the nonprofit West Valley Flying Club. They're not that much cheaper, but you might save a little bit of money there. Or in other areas, such as Los Angeles, the savings for a nonprofit can be significant, much more than, say, in the Bay Area. Number 4 is fly often and finish quickly. The more often you fly, the less you will forget between lessons, and the fewer hours and therefore less money you will spend to get your license. For an idea of scale, I know one person who took over 2 years to get her license. She only flew once, maybe twice a month. She needed over 100 hours before passing her check ride, which is the final exam, and she spent about $20,000 doing so. Conversely, I'll use myself as an example. I finished all the requirements in 3.5 months, and that was still only flying once or twice a week, so that's not a crazy amount. Finished in 46 hours and spent less than $7,000 getting my license. I will say that was in Los Angeles, where planes are cheaper to rent than the Bay Area. But you can see the drastic difference where we were part of the same nonprofit flying club, and she spent roughly 3 times the amount of money and took about 6 times longer to get her license than I did. Recommendation number 5, pass the written exam early. Along with the fly often and finish quickly, if you finish all your flying requirements but haven't passed the written exam, you cannot be signed off or schedule your check ride, your final exam, until that happens. And also studying for the written, although it will take more time to study for the written without the flight experience, it's a lot cheaper to read a book. Reading a book costs you only time, flying costs you a lot more money. So it may not make as much sense to study. It may not make as much sense or be as easy to learn studying up front for the written and the ground knowledge, but it will save money overall. Note that ground school is not required. Some people learn best in a classroom setting. I'm neglecting the pandemic, but talking more generally. Others learn best from visual learning, and others learn best from reading a book. So you have to take your own learning style into account, but you do not have to pay for ground lessons. I did not. I took the free FAA book, which I can actually link to at the end of this talk. I didn't think to prepare that, but I'll post the link in the chat. You can also just Google FAA Flying Handbook. The PDF is free, or you can order a physical copy for just $20. It's a dry book. It reads like a school textbook, and you will want to read it cover to cover if you're not taking ground school. So it's not the most fun way to learn, but it's complete and it's free or very cheap. Also consider time versus distance when training. Everything in training is based around hours, not how far you fly. So flying a slower plane is fine. If you save money, you need the hours, you need the experience. You don't need to fly the latest and greatest Cirrus SR-22, which is what a lot of Silicon Valley tech people tend to learn to fly in, because it's a nice and pretty plane with fancy avionics, but they're spending $300 an hour to rent that plane, whereas you can spend a third of that and rent something much more affordable that's slower. Order matters a lot. The order in which you train, which I'll discuss in detail on the next slide, matters a lot in how much money you can spend depending on the path you're taking. If you want an instrument rating or a commercial license but aren't in a hurry, you can fly with friends and build time over a year or two. So I actually didn't want a commercial license. I have no intention of working as a pilot ever, but over about 2.5 years of flying with friends for fun, going to Oregon or to the Grand Canyon, things like that, I had met 95% of the requirements for my commercial license. So, splitting time with friends, not because I'm trying to work for a commercial license, but just because we were having fun, we split the cost of our trips, and then I was so close, it only took me 3 lessons to prepare for the commercial check ride, plus a lot more ground study. Number 8, whenever 2 certified pilots, this is after you've finished a pilot license, are in the same plane, I strongly recommend that one of you go under the hood, under that view limiting device. Even if you aren't sure that you want to do an instrument rating, it will make you a better and safer pilot to fly precisely based on the instruments in front of you, and also better prepare you for if you do accidentally fly into a cloud, or if you're flying at night over the Central Valley where you don't have an easy sense of horizon because there's not city lights everywhere. Whenever 2 or more pilots are sitting next to each other, unless they both already have instrument ratings, I strongly recommend one of you is wearing a hood and flying the plane that way. Interestingly enough, when you're doing that, you both log pilot and command time because you are both required crew members of the flight. That is the only situation in which 2 private pilots can both log flight time at the same time in the same plane. Number 10 might sound crazy, and I will defend it. Consider buying a or part of a plane. As crazy as this sounds, because of the high rental rates of aircraft in the Bay Area, it can actually be significantly cheaper in the long run to either buy a plane, train, and sell it, or buy a plane that you intend to keep and then train in that aircraft. I fully recognize that not everyone or their families has the money to do this. Please don't feel any pressure to do so. But I've listed a number of aircraft here. The Taylorcraft, Aranca Champ, a Cessna 150 or 152, and Zenith. You can buy well-equipped, safe, ready-to-fly aircraft of those types for less than $20,000 or $30,000. That's more than it will cost to get your license, but training your own aircraft and then selling it at the end, either to upgrade or to rent afterwards, can actually save $5,000 to $10,000 depending how long it takes to get your license. And those 5 types of planes typically do not depreciate in value anymore. They're older aircraft. They're fully depreciated, and unless you crash it, and I recommend you have insurance for that situation, you're not going to lose any money on it. I also listed the Vans RV-12, which is not a cheap airplane. That's $80,000 to $120,000 depending on how you equip it. The only reason I add it to the list is because of the Flying 12 chapter with, or the Flying 12 Flying Club with EAA Chapter 20. They have shares available for $10,000 for I think it's a 1/12 share. I'm not affiliated with them. And if you're interested, other board members can talk to you more about that, but that's another way to have partial ownership for not too much money. The other recommendation is, if you do know what you want to do and how you're going to fly long term, this is less so for the young students, but more for people who are either starting their careers or have a family and learning to fly. If you know what types of flights you're going to be taking cross country, just buy the plane that you want eventually and fly in that. The typical break-even point for owning versus renting an aircraft in the Bay Area is 70 to 80 flight hours per year. If you fly less than that, you're better off renting. If you fly more than that, you're better off owning. And given that most people, the average takes 70 hours to fly, that means if you're going to get your license in less than a year, you save money by renting the plane or by buying the plane. The big bolded caveat is get help if you do this. You're not a pilot. You don't understand what makes a plane safe, what to look for. Have a certified FAA mechanic, do a thorough pre-buy inspection before spending any money on an aircraft, and also get one or many pilots to give you advice on what types of planes you might fit your mission profile because you haven't learned to fly and don't have that level of experience yet. All right, what's next? So you've decided to get a pilot's license. Get your first class medical exam, unless you already know that you'll fail it. If you think you're going to work for the airlines, it would be a travesty to get 1,500 hours of flight experience, only to find out that you are medically disqualified from doing so. So get your first class medical, unless you either definitely won't work for the airlines or already know that you're not qualified and therefore won't work for them anyway. It's only about $20 more than the third class medical exam. Just do it. Start to study. As I mentioned earlier, this can take longer if you aren't flying, but it'll save money to do more of the ground study up front. Private pilot. I already talked earlier on why private is generally for almost everyone better than sport and recreational. One of the exceptions is if you medically don't qualify for becoming a private pilot, you can still get a sport license. But for most young, healthy people who are listening to this talk, just get your private pilot's license. You'll want it eventually, and you'll save money by not doing something else first. Step 4 is enjoy it. Once you've got your license, take some friends flight seeing after COVID. Go fly to Catalina Island for the weekend. Go ski at Tahoe. Once you've got your private pilot's license, generally you're doing it because you want to have fun, even if it's going to be a job. Then do any number of endorsements and instrument training. So those are the high performance, complex, flight and bad weather things that I mentioned earlier. These should all be done before getting your commercial pilot's license, the instrument rating in particular. Number 6 would be the commercial pilot, if you're continuing to pursue that route. And if you aren't in a rush to do it, you can build the 250 hours slowly, flying with friends or family on trips, like I mentioned, to save money that way and splitting costs. If you do want to pursue a career in aviation and want to build towards those 1,500 hours, strongly consider becoming a certified flight instructor, because then you get paid by students and log hours along the way. So once you have your commercial license, you become eligible to take the CFI exams the next day. There's no time or gap. You have to learn to fly from the right seat. You have to learn how to instruct, put lessons plans together. So there are things you need to do between the two, but there's no time or hours restrictions. You're ready immediately. Number 8, other categories and classes. So this is flying aircraft with multiple engines, gliders, seaplanes. I assume most of you will start flying land aircraft, powered parachute, helicopter, etc. I strongly recommend that you do not do these types of training until after getting your commercial license, unless you don't intend to get your commercial license. Here's why. If you get a commercial pilot's license in a single engine land aircraft, and then you go get a glider or multi-engine license, you will also have a commercial license in that category. If you have a private license and or instrument rating in single engine land, then do multi-engine and then get your commercial license, your commercial license will only be in one or the other, only single engine or only multi-engine. You can add it to the second one, but that typically doing it in both costs you several extra $1,000. So single engine land is cheaper than helicopters and cheaper than multi-engine, cheaper than seaplane. So most people will fly single engine land aircraft. After you have your commercial pilot's license, then go for ratings in other categories and classes. Again, if you're not going to be a commercial pilot, that doesn't apply, but that's a way to save several $1,000s. If you are going to work for the airlines, try to get some turbine time, so jet time along the way, particularly on someone else's dime. It's harder than it used to be, from what I'm told. I have no turbine time at all, so I'm not the right person to tell you on how to do this, but the airlines look upon it favorably if you do get it. And then step 10 is the airline transport pilot. So welcome to the airlines. You'll typically start working for a regional airline like Mesa or Horizon. Those are the subcontractors who fly the small jets for the big airlines. They might call it like, they will sell under United or American tickets, but they're the smaller planes. And then after a few years, you'll typically make the move to the major airlines, that being, Southwest, United, American, Delta, etc. The pilot unions are tenure-based, so fly safe, get your time in, and you can have a long career if you so choose. Because it's tenure-based at the airline, once you are at one of the majors, it's almost unheard of for people to jump from, say, American to United, because your tenure resets, and most people are unwilling to take that pay cut and loss of seniority. All right, and finally, don't forget why you started. You probably have one of these views of being a pilot. None of them are completely accurate, but you can tailor your flying to whichever area excites you the most. And with that, are there any questions?
Yeah, Alexander, thank you so much for taking the time out for this intriguing presentation. Now it's time for some Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So our first question is, do you have recommendations for private pilots on what order of ratings to get?
Did that question come before I answered this? If it was posted more than 3 minutes ago, I'll assume I already answered it.
What is the most difficult thing to master while training to receive an endorsement for tailwheel?
So the challenge of tailwheel and why it scares some people is because it's a little bit harder to land. So in a nose wheel plane, which is like the jets where you have one wheel in front and two larger ones in back, The center of mass is in front of your brakes. So let's say this way is forward and these are the rear wheels. So when you're braking, the brakes give stability and cause the plane to want to be straight down the runway. When you're in a tailwheel plane, it's the opposite. The center of mass wants to keep moving forward. So if you brake unevenly and the center of mass gets out from behind the wheels, you can spin around. Some people say, and that's called a ground loop. You're not going to die, and rarely get injured, but you'll typically damage the plane if you ground loop it. That's the downside of learning tailwheel, but it really doesn't take most people very much time. Even if you already have your private pilot's license, most people take less than 10 hours to transition. And if you just do your primary instruction in tailwheel aircraft, which can actually typically be cheaper because fewer people fly them, they rent for less money on the average, I'm generalizing, then it's not anything special for you. It's just landing. So if you think you might want to fly tailwheel, I actually recommend you just get your license in a tailwheel plane. It's not going to take you any longer because you're learning to land for the first time. It doesn't matter which type you're doing. The reason it costs more and takes more time to transition from nose to tail wheel is because you learned a bunch of bad habits while flying nose wheel and now have to unlearn them and relearn for tail wheel. If you just learn in tail wheel, then you just learned. I'm biased because I own a tail wheel aircraft, but even still, I've talked to many other pilots, and typically anyone who's flown a tail wheel agrees that it's just as easy to learn in one the first time.
So what counts as a cross-country flight hour?
Cross-country flight hours are flights where you land further than 50 nautical miles away from your point of departure. And a nautical mile is 1.15 normal statute miles. So it's a little less, but call it 60 miles away.
So how often do you fly in a week, and how many hours off the ground each time?
And how many hours of the ground?
How many hours are you in the air?
Gotcha. So when training, I flew 1 or 2 lessons a week, and most lessons were about 2 hours ballpark. We would aim for 2 if we finished earlier or took a little longer. It wasn't a huge deal. These days, I typically take weekend trips, and I usually fly every other weekend on a longer trip, and then might do something closer one day for fun in between that or something like that. That's my personal flight mission, and every person will be different there.
What was your most memorable moment in the air when you were learning how to fly?
That would be my first lesson. So we did a walk around of the plane. The instructor shows me different major parts and what you inspect for safety before taking off. He then starts the engine, explains what he's doing, teaches me a little bit of how to taxi and steer on the ground. He then says, all right, I'm going to take off. And once we get in the air, we'll start practicing. So he takes off, talks me through what he's doing as he does it. We're about 200 feet off the ground. He takes his hands off the controls and says, okay, you're flying the plane now. I had never had a lesson before. I'd never been in a small plane before. He just took his hands off, and I'm like, what? He goes, well, I'm not flying, so you better start. So I actually appreciated that in hindsight, not at the time, because he took the attitude of, try things. I won't let you do anything unsafe, and you're going to learn much faster because of that. And I think because my instructor took that approach is why I was able to learn in close to the minimum hours required.
Did you get your ratings before the commercial check ride?
Yes, I got my instrument rating before the commercial check ride. I do not have a multi-engine glider or seaplane rating. I started training for my glider commercial add-on right before the pandemic started, but the place I was doing it put instruction on hold because of COVID.
What was the hardest lesson you learned from flying?
I wouldn't say there was a hardest lesson per se, but I would say for myself and others, the hard parts typically are not flying the plane, it's navigating and communicating. Like, you'll have trouble flying at first because you've never done it before, but it's typically the communication on the radio, knowing what phraseology to use, what to expect, and also listening for things that aren't expected, and being able to navigate, outside of the Bay Area or Los Angeles, where I learned to fly, and planning a trip from LA to Idaho when I'd never flown more than 150 miles away before, and things like that.
What are your thoughts on practicing in a simulator?
It depends. So I honestly think that flying a simulator feels harder to me personally than flying in the real plane, because you don't get the same sensual feel of the aircraft. You're just looking at a screen and looking more at gauges. So some people learn well in simulators and can save money by doing some of their training. Others, like myself, it's not beneficial, and I tried it once. I was like, this is harder, and did all my training in actual planes and was able to do all of my ratings in close to the minimum hours required.
Is your 70 to 80 hour break even point for a full airplane and not a share?
That's for a full aircraft, correct. So if you have a share of a plane, let's say you buy 50% of a plane, it's not exactly half, but say 60% of that. So if two people own a plane, I would say combined, they should be flying about 100 hours a year. That math is different for the Bay Area. In most other parts of the country, the break-even point for one person is around 100 hours, but we have very elevated rental rates for aircraft here in the Bay.
When we buy a used car, you look for something at less than 80,000 miles. What is the criteria for looking into buying a plane or being a part owner of a plane?
Sure. So this is why I recommend that you get advice. I'll give a short answer, but you should get much more detailed help either from me, another pilot and owner on the board, or any other aircraft owner that you know, beyond the scope of this talk. The short answer is, unlike a car where you'll have a mechanic look at it for half an hour or something and sanity check that it's safe, an aircraft mechanic should do a full 1 to 2 day pre-buy inspection, opening every single inspection panel, doing a borescope inside the engine, and looking at things that you as a buyer just will not be familiar with. And a pre-buy is worth every penny that you pay for it. But in terms of, there's no miles on an engine, on an aircraft. Instead, we look at hours, and total hours either flown for the engine, for the airframe, because you can replace the engine, things like that. And one common misconception is that low hours are better. Low hours, if it's because things are new, are better, but aircraft that fly more frequently actually last longer. A perfect example is the FAA and Lycoming, who makes most of the piston aircraft engines of the planes that we fly behind. If you fly the plane normally, and as a typical person, they recommend that you rebuild the engine after 2,000 hours. If you fly it more than 40 hours a month, which is typically in a flight school operation, then they allow you to go to 2,400 engine hours before it needs a rebuild. So it wears out less the more you run it, which is counterintuitive, but that's because most plane parts don't wear out, they corrode. So it's much more time-based than pure usage-based. And again, this is why I recommend you get much more advice before you go online and put an offer on a plane tonight.
What does it take to become a CFI once you have a PPO?
I'm not a flight instructor, so I won't give a very detailed answer, but basically you have to take 2 written exams. One is on fundamentals of instruction, and the other is more about being CFI itself. You have to learn to fly from the right seat, because your student will fly on the left. And then the check ride is basically the CFI sits in the right while the examiner sits in the left. and the CFI has to teach and do maneuvers and explain what they're doing while they're doing it, and then when the examiner does something wrong on purpose, the CFI has to correct it before the examiner kills the two of them.
Once you have a PPL, how often do you need to fly or take additional exams to maintain it?
So technically, a license never expires, but you have to maintain what's called currency. To be current, you need a current medical exam, the frequency of which is dependent on the pilot's level and age, anywhere from 5 years before the age of 40 to 2 years after the age of 40 for the first 3 licenses, which are the common ones. So I'll focus on those. 1 year for commercial, etc. You also need to do a flight review not with the FAA, but with any flight instructor every 2 years. That's minimum 1 hour ground and 1 hour in the air. And then there are other types of currency. To carry passengers, you have to have at least 3 landings in the last 90 days. To carry passengers at night, you have to have at least 3 night landings in the last 90 days. However, if you get out of those types of currency, you are legally allowed to just go fly by yourself to become current again and then carry passengers. You don't need a flight instructor. Now, I said legally, many flight schools, if you're renting, or flight clubs, will require that you get current with an instructor, even though it's not an FAA requirement.
Do you have recommendations for friendly training pilots like that in the Bay Area?
It's a little hard to hear you. Can you say that one again?
Do you have recommendations for friendly training pilots like that in the Bay Area?
Friendly training pilots?
Like your first lesson story.
They're asking for flight instructor recommendations?
Yeah.
So I learned to fly in Los Angeles, so I know many more people down there. I've flown once or twice with a couple instructors in the Bay, but no one that I've become experienced enough with to strongly recommend them. No issues, just I don't feel comfortable referring someone after an hour. I do know that there's an instructor that's been working with the Flying 12 group in EAA Chapter 20. I'm not sure his name, but I'm sure Oliver or someone else could connect you.
Since I train on a caster-in nose wheel plane, will it take longer for me to get my tail wheel because I have a habit of only taxiing with brakes?
That's a bad habit in general. But it's also a habit that tail wheel pilots sometimes develop because most tail wheels are also castering, and some are steerable. Like mine is steerable, but many are castering only. It depends is the short answer. There's not a single answer for that.
Yeah, and the last question is, what is a student license?
What is a student life?
A student license.
Student license. Basically, a student license, there's no exam or anything else affiliated with it. You have to either prove U.S. citizenship and have the FAA do a background check, or if you're not a citizen, then there's a TSA authorization process to get it. And you only need the student license before you solo. You don't actually need it to learn to fly with a flight instructor, just before you can fly solo as a student.
And actually, there's one more question. Why is tail wheel better for backcountry?
Sure. So a nose wheel plane, when you're on the ground, you're completely flat. Tail wheel sits nose up, so the propeller is further away from the ground and less likely to get damaged by rocks. Additionally, because you have the large wheels in front, it's much more robust and less likely to tip over or damage the nose wheel. There's a much longer explanation of why, but basically, if you're landing on rough or unimproved surfaces, it's much safer for the plane in particular to do so in a tail wheel than a nose wheel.
Yeah. Alexander, thank you so much for taking the time out for an intriguing presentation. To everyone else at the EAA, we have a plethora of opportunities available for people of all ages to avail. And To keep updated with the Young Aviators, follow our Instagram at YoungAviators1 and our YouTube channel at tinyurl.com/YoungAviators3.